Hello and welcome to this video on consumer and producer surplus. In this video, we're going to look at what these concepts means. We're going to look at how we illustrate them using diagrams and look at how changes in demand and supply affect consumer and producer surplus. So this topic is really all about the difference between value and price. So if I said to you, what does getting value for money mean? You might make the distinguishing comment that there is a difference between how much someone values a good or service and how much they actually have to pay for it. It's kind of the nature of a bargain. You might say, well, that's worth 10 euros to me, but I only paid 3. I got a great bargain. So there's a difference here between the value, the welfare or value, or sometimes in economics we call it the utility that we get from consuming a good or service, and that's different to the price we actually pay, the market equilibrium price that we end up paying. So consumers don't always have to pay the maximum price they're willing to pay. Sometimes you get a bargain, you get kind of this idea that value of a product or service can be higher than the price that you actually pay for it. So let's have a look here. We would normally say that my willingness to pay goes down as I consume extra units. And we call this diminishing marginal utility or diminishing marginal satisfaction. For example, for the first slice of cake, I might pay quite a high price. For the second slice of cake, not quite so much. Now I'm feeling a bit sick. The third slice of cake, I'm not going to pay as much for that one, and so on and so on. If I was to draw these points together, effectively what I get is my demand curve, the relationship between price and how many units I would want to buy. And so we can use a demand curve here to measure the kind of welfare or value that consumers are getting above and beyond the market price. So let's have a look at this diagram here with price of per pizza and the number of pizza slices consumed. Here's our demand curve. And we're going to say that the current market price is £3 per pizza. And at that market price, I would be prepared to consume 15 slices of pizza. But for that fifth slice of pizza, I would be willing to pay £6. Now, the fact I'm willing to pay £6, but I only have to pay £3 means that there is a difference here. There is a difference between the price I'm willing to pay and the actual market price that I do pay. And this is really my consumer surplus. For that fifth slice of pizza, I have a surplus here of value over price of £3. So the consumer surplus is the difference between what the consumer is willing to pay and the price they actually do pay. So this is an important definition. Let's make sure we've got this down in our notes, and then we can have a look at this example. So we've said here that for the fifth slice of pizza, I was willing to pay £6, but I only paid £3. For the second slice of pizza, I was willing to pay even more, but I only paid £3. For this slice of pizza over here, I only paid what looks like about £5. Sorry, I only paid £3, but I would have paid £5 and so on. If I add together all of these values, I get an area like this. I get this area here, which represents the total consumer surplus, the total area that represents where my value exceeds the price that I'm willing to pay. So the consumer surplus at the equilibrium price is the difference between what people are willing to pay and what they actually pay. So this area here is really the sum of all these little bits of value added together, and the blue area in total represents the consumer surplus. It's a measure of the consumer's value where it's in excess of the price they actually have to pay. Now, if the demand curve is very inelastic, we can see that the consumer surplus area is actually going to be very large. We're going to have very large consumer surplus. It's going to be represented by this triangle here, and we've got a significant amount of consumer surplus there. When the demand curve is more price elastic, we can see our consumer surplus area here is actually quite small. It's only a small amount of consumer surplus where we have elastic demand curve. So here's a nice comparison where we can see what changes consumer surplus when we have shifts in demand and supply. So let's look at the left-hand diagram first of all, and we can see that initially with demand curve D1, the consumer surplus represented by this area here. This was the original consumer surplus represented by that area where the willingness to pay exceeds the market price P1. Now, if demand shifts to the right to D2, we have a new area of consumer surplus, and that is indicated by this area here. And what we can see is that the blue triangle, the new consumer surplus, is bigger than the red triangle, so an increase in demand here has caused higher consumer surplus. On the right hand side, we can see a similar story with supply. The original supply curve S1 gives us a consumer surplus here, indicated by the red line. When supply has shifted to S2, what we can see is that increases the area of consumer surplus again to the blue triangle, and we can see that the blue triangle is much bigger than the red triangle, so again we have higher consumer surplus. So to summarize, consumer surplus is a measure of the welfare that people gain from the consumption of goods and services. It's the difference between the total amount that consumers are willing to and able to pay for a good or service and the total amount they actually pay, the market price. The level of consumer surplus is shown by the area under the demand curve and above the current market clearing price. Now let's move on and talk about producer surplus. Producer surplus is a measure of producer welfare. So we're thinking about it from firms or businesses' point of view now, and it is measured as the difference between what producers are willing and able to supply a good for, the price at which they're willing and able to supply for, and the price they actually receive. The level of producer surplus is shown by the area above the supply curve and below the market price. So first of all, we can use the supply curve and the market diagram here to work out how much money the business is receiving in total, the supplier is receiving in total. And we can do that by multiplying the price, the market price, by the current quantity supplied. So in this example, the price is £20 and the market is currently buying and selling 100 units. So the total revenue here would be 20 times 100, £2,000. We can also use our diagram here to show producer surplus. So at the price of £20, we would say that 100 units are being produced. Now, let's have a look again. For example, this first unit here, the supplier receives £20, that's the market price from selling that unit, but they would have sold that unit for this amount down here. So actually the difference between the two is value to the supplier. They would have sold it for this low price, they actually sell it for the £20, and so there is value for the supplier. Let's have a look at perhaps the 50th unit. Now here they receive £20 for the unit because that's the market price, that's what they're selling all their products at, but they would have been able to, or they would be willing to sell for a lower price. So again, the gap here represents value to the supplier. If we do it for all of the units, we get an area ultimately that represents the surplus or the value to the producer. So this area here represents the producer surplus. So the total producer surplus is represented by the area between the supply curve and the current market price. So this diagram here shows us the producer surplus and also the consumer surplus. So that the current market price in this example here is £20, and the consumer surplus is the difference between what they're willing to pay and the current market price, whereas the producer surplus is the difference between what they're willing to supply at and the current market price. So in this film, we've looked at what is meant by consumer and producer surplus. We've illustrated both concepts graphically, and we've looked at how changes in demand and supply will impact both. That's it. Thanks for listening.